Status
data
report.
files
Is
on
the fleet
humanity
aligned?
were thicker
Confirmed.
than any
All ships are in
species
formation
Orville had
advancing.
reviewed in 40
Good.
years
Prepare
of
for
diplomatic
engagement.
work. He sat at his desk on the ship and turned the pages slowly. 3 invasion attempts, 3 failures, not because humans had better weapons, though their weapons were surprisingly effective for a young species. Not because they had allies. They had none. It was because every time someone came to take something from them, they simply refused to stop fighting. No calculation of loss. No threshold at which they surrendered. They just kept going until the other side left. Syl stood near the observation window and looked down at the blue planet below. It was smaller than it seemed in the files, quieter looking. Green and white clouds moving slowly over brown land. Nothing about it looked dangerous. That was the part that bothered Syl the most. Orvith closed the file. "They are unorganized," he said. "Different governments, different languages, they argue with each other constantly. The internal political records alone fill 3 data cores. They are not a unified species in any meaningful sense." "They unified fast enough when the Vreth fleet arrived," Syl said. Orvith waved a hand. "Fear response. Instinct. It will not hold in a diplomatic setting. These people cannot even agree on what to eat." Syl did not answer. The planet kept turning below. The transport took them down through pale clouds and landed outside a building in a city called Geneva. Humans had chosen it because it had historical meaning for them, a place where they had signed agreements with each other across centuries of conflict. Orvith found this slightly amusing. A species that had fought so many wars it needed a dedicated city for making peace. The hall inside was large and neutral. Long table, human security at the doors, small flags from different Earth governments along the walls. The humans had brought translators, technical staff, and 1 delegate, just one. Her name was Dara. She was not tall. She wore plain dark clothing. She had short gray hair and eyes that did not move much when she was listening. Orvith introduced himself and his team. Dara nodded once and sat down. He delivered the offer cleanly and professionally. It was a good offer by any galactic standard. Earth would fall under Council protection, which meant no species would dare attack them again. A Council-appointed overseer would assist with governance and help integrate Earth into galactic trade systems. Human military forces would be reduced and eventually folded into a joint peacekeeping structure. In return, Earth would receive medical technology, agricultural support, faster-than-light travel access, and a seat in the lower council chamber within 20 years. Orvith finished speaking. He folded his hands on the table. Dara looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked at him. "No," she said. The words sat in the room like something heavy dropped on the floor. Orvith blinked. His aide, a young counselor named Foss, actually wrote something down and then stopped writing because he did not know what to write. "I am sorry," Orvith said. "The answer is no," Dara said again, same tone, same volume. "We appreciate the detail of the offer. We understand the intent behind it. The answer is still no." Orvith leaned forward slightly. "Delegate, I want to make sure you understand what is being offered here. Protection from future attacks, advanced technology, economic integration with over 300 species. The Council has never extended terms this generous to a species at your stage of development." "I heard you the first time," Dara said. "Then perhaps you would share your concerns so we can address them." She looked at the table for a second, not nervous, just thinking about whether the conversation was worth having. Then she said, "You are offering us safety in exchange for control. The Overseer makes decisions that currently belong to elected governments. The military reduction leaves us dependent on Council forces we do not command. The trade access comes through systems we did not build and cannot modify. In 20 years we get a seat in a chamber that has no veto power." She paused. "That is not a partnership. That is a very comfortable acquisition." Orvith opened his mouth. Dara continued. "I am not accusing you of bad faith. I think you believe this is generous. I think every species you have ever made this offer to probably looked at the numbers and said yes, because the short-term benefits are real. I am saying that we are not interested in the long-term outcome of that arrangement." The room was very quiet. Orvith looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Syl. Syl was looking at Dara with an expression Orvith could not immediately classify. Not alarm, not agreement, something closer to recognition. "We will return with revised terms," Orvith said carefully. "You are welcome to," Dara said. She stood, which apparently meant the meeting was over. "We will be here." On the transport back up to the ship, nobody spoke for a long time. Foss eventually asked Orvith what the revised terms should include. Orvith said he needed to think. That was unusual. He never needed to think after a first meeting. First meetings were always the same. Syl looked out the transport window at the city growing smaller below. Millions of people down there, who had survived 3 alien invasions, and still sent one quiet woman to a table to say no to the entire Galactic Council. Syl pulled out a personal data pad and began a new file. Not an official report, just notes. Something about this species needed to be understood before it could be negotiated with. And Syl was beginning to suspect that understanding them might change more than just the negotiation. They came back 4 days later with a revised offer. Orvith had spent those 4 days in his cabin rewriting terms, consulting legal archives, and pulling every favorable precedent he could find. The new offer removed the overseer clause. It replaced the military reduction with a voluntary joint training program. The trade access was restructured, so Earth held partial administrative rights. The lower chamber seat was moved up to 10 years instead of 20. It was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary revision. His staff told him it was the most generous second offer in Council diplomatic history. Dara listened to all of it. Then she asked if the Council delegation would come somewhere with her before she gave her answer. Orvith was curious enough to say yes. She took them through the city, not the clean government district where the summit hall sat, but the actual city. The streets were loud and uneven, old buildings next to new ones, signs in 4 different languages on the same block. She walked at a normal pace and said nothing, just let them see. First stop was a hospital, not the entrance or the lobby. She took them through working corridors where staff in worn clothing moved quickly with equipment and files. A child was being treated in one room with the door open. Nobody stopped to perform for the visitors. They were all too busy. Orvith noticed the equipment was old in places, patched and repaired rather than replaced. He noticed that every patient he could see was being treated regardless, no sorting happening at any desk they passed. Foss leaned toward Orvith and whispered that the medical technology was far below Council standard. Orvith nodded. He knew. That was not the point. He was starting to understand that the point was something else, though he could not yet name it. Second stop was a school. Loud. Children arguing about something at a table in one room. A teacher in another room letting 2 students debate something on a board, both of them wrong, the teacher watching them figure it out themselves. Paper everywhere. Drawings on the walls that had no artistic quality but had been put up anyway. One child ran past Syl in the corridor at full speed and did not apologize. Syl watched the child disappear around a corner and made a note on the data pad. Third stop was a district at the edge of the city. Dara told them without drama that this neighborhood had been flattened during the second invasion attempt 11 years ago. The buildings that stood there now had been built by the people who lived in them. Some were crooked. Some were clearly built by people who had never built anything before. Gardens in the front yards, uneven but producing food. A wall on one street was painted with names and faces. Dara did not explain what it was. She just let them look. Orvith stood in front of that wall for a moment. He counted the faces. There were a lot of them. They walked back to the transit vehicles in silence. When they were seated and moving, Orvith turned to Dara and said, "We brought you a revised offer. It addresses the concerns you raised." "I know," Dara said. "I read it this morning." And she looked at him, not unkindly. "The overseer is gone, which is good. But the inspection clause in Section 4 gives council representatives authority to flag military developments for review. That is the overseer by another name, just slower. The joint training program sounds equal, but the command structure defaults to council officers above a certain rank. And the partial administrative rights in trade exist only for routes we are permitted to operate on. We do not get to open new ones without council approval." She paused. "It is a better cage, but it is still a cage." Orvith sat back. He had no immediate answer. Foss looked frustrated. He said, "With respect, Delegate, there is no offer that gives Earth full autonomy and full council protection simultaneously. Those two things are structurally in tension. Every species that has joined the council has accepted some version of this balance." "I know," Dara said. "That is what concerns me." Syl looked up from the data pad. Dara continued, "I'm not saying the council is cruel. I'm not saying your intentions are bad. I am saying that every species that took this deal is still in it, and none of them are more than they were when they signed. Safe, stable, provided for, but not more." She looked out the window. "We are a difficult species. We know that. We have caused ourselves tremendous suffering through our own decisions. But every time we hit a wall, we also somehow go through it or over it or around it. I do not think we do that inside a structure that decides what walls we are allowed to approach." The vehicle stopped at the summit hall entrance. Dara opened the door and stepped out. She turned back once. "Send a third offer if you want. We will read it carefully. We always read carefully." She almost smiled. "We just also always say what we think." She walked inside. Orvith sat in the vehicle for a moment, then he looked at Syl. Syl was writing something. Orvith asked what. Syl said, "I am writing down what she said about going through walls. I want to check something in the long-term absorbed species data when we get back." Orvith did not ask what they expected to find. He was beginning to suspect he already knew and was not ready to look at it yet. The faction inside the council that wanted a harder approach had been quiet during the first 2 rounds of talks. They were not quiet anymore. Councillor Vren, who represented 6 mid-tier industrial species and controlled a significant portion of the council's internal vote weight, submitted a formal complaint that the negotiations were being handled with insufficient leverage. His argument was simple. The council had never needed more than 2 rounds with any species. A third round with no concession from the human side was an embarrassment. The humans were not negotiating. They were stalling, or worse, they were simply not afraid enough. Vren proposed moving a fleet to the edge of Earth's solar system, not an invasion force. A reminder, a visual argument, he called it a posture of presence. His proposal passed by 11 votes. Orvith voted against it. Syl was not permitted to vote. Fleet Commander Breck received the order on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar, though he did not track Earth calendars. He read the deployment order twice, noted that it included explicit instructions to take no hostile action, and then called his tactical crew together and gave them their heading. He was a careful man. He followed orders with precision. But he also kept a personal log, which was allowed but rarely done at his rank, and that evening he wrote one line in it. "This species does not look frightened in any of the surveillance footage, and I am not certain what that means for us." The fleet arrived at the outer edge of Earth's solar system 9 days later. 17 ships, not the largest force the Council could deploy, but large enough to be unambiguous. Earth detected them within hours. Dara was in a government briefing room when the news came in. The room was full of officials who had been waiting for something like this, some of them afraid, some of them angry. A general at the far end of the table wanted to scramble defense formations immediately. A trade minister asked whether any council member species could be contacted for support. Both of them were already treating it as a crisis. Dara looked at the tactical screen for a long time. The fleet was sitting still, not advancing, just sitting there, which was the point. She said, start the internal supply chain protocols, soft rationing on imported goods, stand up the civil volunteer units in the 6 major cities. She looked at the general. Defense formations stay where they are. We do not move toward them. The general said that looked like weakness. Dara said it looked like patience, which was different. The next 2 weeks were strange. The Council fleet sat at the edge of the system. Earth reorganized. Supply chains went internal. Rationing happened quietly, announced through normal civic channels without alarm language. Volunteer civil units formed in cities and registered with local governments. People showed up, not because they were ordered to, because they had done versions of this before and they understood the shape of it. Council surveillance drones that entered Earth's atmosphere sent back footage that confused Breck considerably. He watched markets still functioning, children still going to school, a protest in one major city about something that had nothing to do with the fleet whatsoever. People were annoyed about a proposed water policy. He watched the footage for an hour. Then he sent it to Orvith with no message attached. On the 15th day, a small human vessel appeared at the edge of the fleet's position. It was moving slowly and had a white signal flag encoded in its communication array, an old human symbol that the Council translators recognized from historical records as meaning non-hostile approach. Breck watched it come. One ship, no weapons hot, no escort. It stopped a measured distance from the lead Council vessel and transmitted a single message. No visual, just audio in clean translated galactic standard. The message said, "Humanity does not intend to fire first. Humanity will not negotiate while a fleet is positioned at its doorstep. Remove the fleet and talks can resume. Keep the fleet and there will be no further talks. Not now and not at any point in the future. This is not a threat. It is a description of what will happen." The transmission ended. The bridge was silent. Breck's second officer asked what they should do. Breck did not answer immediately. He was looking at that one small ship sitting in front of 17 Council vessels. It was not a warship. It looked like a converted cargo hauler. Its hull had patches on it. It had come out here alone, under a white flag, and delivered a calm statement and then just sat there waiting. He thought about the footage of the water policy protest. He thought about the rebuilt neighborhood with the wall of painted faces. He thought about 3 invasion attempts and none of them working. He sent a communication to Vren and Orvith. He wrote, "I recommend we consider the message carefully before responding. My assessment is that this species will do exactly what it said. I have seen no evidence in 11 weeks of surveillance that suggests otherwise." Vren sent back a one-line reply telling Breck to hold position and wait for Council deliberation. Breck held position, but he wrote another line in his personal log that night. He wrote they sent a cargo hauler. The research room on the Council administrative station had no windows. Syl had requested it specifically because windows meant interruptions, and what Syl was doing needed to be uninterrupted. The absorbed species database was not secret. It was simply large and boring enough that almost nobody ever went through all of it. Centuries of data on hundreds of species, population tables, cultural output records, scientific publication rates, economic development indices, all of it logged, maintained, and almost never read by anyone who was not writing a formal policy summary. Syl started at the beginning and worked forward. The Orani had been a species of singers. Their oral tradition went back 6,000 years. Complex rhythmic histories passed between generations, each one slightly changed by the teller, which meant the tradition was alive and evolving. Syl found their cultural output records after absorption. The singing continued, but the new composition stopped. Within 30 years, the tradition was performing only established pieces. Within 60 years, it was classified as a preserved heritage practice. Within 100 years, it was a museum program performed 3 times a year at cultural festivals. The Duvicai had been engineers. Before absorption, their innovation rate, meaning the number of new patents, new structural approaches, new materials, had been accelerating. They had been in the middle of something. Syl could see it in the data, a curve going sharply upward in the decades before the Council arrived. After absorption, the curve flattened within a generation, not because the Duvicai stopped working. They kept working. They just stopped making things that had not been made before. Everything they built after that fit inside existing Council frameworks, which was useful and sufficient and completely unlike what they had been doing before. The Pelosi had been philosophers. Their pre-absorption records contained 17 distinct and actively competing schools of thought, several of which disagreed with each other loudly and publicly and had been doing so for 2 centuries. After absorption, 4 schools remained. They were the ones that did not contradict Council civic principles. The other 13 were not banned. They just stopped receiving funding, stopped getting students, and quietly closed. Syl sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long time, then pulled up Earth's file and set it beside the others. Earth's record was chaotic. Wars that killed millions, political systems that collapsed and got rebuilt differently, religious movements that rose and fractured and merged and separated again, scientific fields that started from wrong assumptions, got corrected publicly and sometimes badly, and then advanced anyway. Art that was ugly and art that was extraordinary, often made in the same decade by people in the same city. Medicine developed in the middle of active conflicts. Humanitarian systems built by people who had just survived disasters. A species that kept moving because it apparently did not know how to stop. Syl read it for 2 hours, then opened a new file, not a formal report, something unofficial, and began writing to Dara. It was a strange thing to do. Syl had never communicated unofficially with a negotiating party before. It was not technically prohibited, but it was the kind of thing that would end a career if it went through official channels. Syl used a secondary relay, the kind used for personal correspondence between station staff, and sent the absorbed species data attached to no message at all. Just the files, organized and clear, sourced correctly, nothing that could be called an opinion. Just numbers. That night Syl could not sleep and went back to the data. Found a record that had not appeared in the main file because it was filed under a different species classification. A small species called the Wenec. They had been absorbed 230 years ago under the standard peace offer. Before absorption, their world had been in the middle of something that the Council report at the time called political instability. Reading the actual pre-absorption records, Syl saw that the instability was a reform movement. A large portion of the Wenec population had been pushing to change how resources were distributed. The movement was loud and disruptive and had no guaranteed outcome. After absorption, it stopped. The Council overseer had recommended stability measures. The movement dissolved. Resources stayed as they were. The Council report filed 5 years later noted that Wenec society had stabilized successfully. The Wenec population had been declining slowly ever since. Not dying, just not growing, not changing. The most recent census showed a species that was, by every measurable standard, fine. Syl closed the file and stared at the wall. Fine was not the same as alive. Syl was only now understanding that this distinction existed, which meant it had been missing from every diplomatic calculation the Council had ever made about what it was offering. A reply came through the unofficial channel the next morning. It was one word. Understood. Syl read it 3 times, then closed the channel, stood up, and went to find Orvith, not to report, not yet, just to look at his face and see if he was ready to hear any of this. He was eating a meal when Syl found him. He looked tired. The standoff with Earth was entering its 3rd week, and the Council chamber was arguing about next steps in ways that were becoming loud. Syl sat down across from him and said nothing for a moment. Orvith looked up. What did you find? Syl told him about the Irani singers. That was all, just the one case. Orvith put down his food and did not pick it up again. Sil filed the motion on a quiet morning when the chamber was scheduled for routine administrative business. It was placed third on the agenda, after a resource allocation review and before a border demarcation hearing. The title was dry and technical: Proposal to Suspend Active Negotiation Proceedings with Earth Pending Welfare Review of Standard Absorption Protocol Outcomes. Nobody paid attention to it until it was called. Then Orvith read the full summary into the record, which took 4 minutes. By the second minute, the chamber was no longer quiet. Councillor Vren was on his feet before Orvith finished. He called the motion an insult to the diplomatic process. He said the data being cited was historical routine and had already been reviewed during previous council governance studies. He said bringing it forward now, in the middle of an active standoff with an uncooperative species, was not a coincidence and was not appropriate. He looked directly at Sil when he said the word uncooperative. 3 other senior councillors spoke in support of Vren. One of them used the phrase contaminated perspective, meaning that anyone who had spent too much time in direct contact with humans might have developed a distorted view of their reasonableness. This was not aimed at Orvith, who had spent the most time in those meetings. It was aimed at Sil, who was the one who had filed the motion. Sil sat at the junior representative table and said nothing. The rules of the chamber meant the filing party did not respond until the full discussion period ended. So Sil sat and listened to 40 minutes of debate. Some of it was hostile. Some of it was genuinely confused. A few senior members seemed to be hearing the absorbed species data for the first time and not enjoying what they heard, not because it upset them morally, but because it raised questions that were administratively inconvenient. One middle-rank counselor from a small aquatic species asked a quiet question during a pause in the debate. She asked, if absorbed species remain stable but stop developing, at what point does the council consider that a negative outcome rather than a neutral one? Nobody answered her directly. The debate moved on, but Sil wrote the question down. The vote came at the end of the session. The motion failed, 31 against, 22 in favor. By the standards of council votes on governance questions, it was unusually close. Vren looked satisfied but not fully comfortable. He had expected a wider margin. The chamber cleared slowly. Sil collected the data files and stood. 3 people approached before Sil reached the door. 2 junior representatives from small species Sil had never spoken with directly. One was from the Wenec. The other was from a species called the Chalari, which Sil knew from the data had been absorbed about 80 years ago. The third was the aquatic counselor who had asked the quiet question. The Wenec representative looked at Sil and said, "Can we have the full data set?" Sil handed over 3 copies without saying anything. The aquatic counselor said, "The vote failed." "Yes," Sil said. "You knew it would." "Yes." The counselor looked at Sil for a moment. "Then why file it?" "Because now 22 people inside this chamber have read the absorption data carefully and voted on it by name," Sil said. "That is a record. It cannot be unfiled. And those 3 species you are holding on your way out of this room will read it tonight. And they will tell others. The motion failing is not the point. The motion existing is the point." The counselor looked down at the files in her hands. Then she left. Orvith appeared from a side corridor and fell into step with Sil. He had voted in favor of the motion. He had done it quietly and had not spoken during the debate. His name was now on the official record as one of the 22. They walked a while without talking. Then Orvith said, "Vren is going to push for an escalation measure. He has the votes for a formal ultimatum. Earth accepts terms within 30 days or the fleet advances to a closer position." "I know," Sil said. "What does Earth do when that happens?" "The same thing they always do," Sil said. "They say no." Orvith stopped walking. He stood in the corridor and looked at the floor. He was a man who had spent 40 years believing that the Council system was the best available answer to the chaos of ungoverned space. He had believed it completely and without much examination because the evidence around him had always seemed to support it. Everyone who joined became safer. Everyone who joined became stable. He had never thought to ask what else they became. "The singers," he said. "The singers," Syl confirmed. He stood there for another moment, then he started walking again. Syl walked with him. On Earth, Dara received word of the vote result through an official council communication that evening. The communication was formal and dry. It noted that the motion had failed and that negotiations remained open pending further council direction. It said nothing about what the vote count had been. The unofficial channel told her the count, 22 in favor. She read the name of the species that had approached Syl at the door and requested the data files. She sat with that for a while. Then she wrote a short statement for her own government. She said that humanity had not come to break the council, only to remain itself. If the council chose to reform, Earth would talk. If it did not, Earth would wait. She sent it. Then she made a cup of tea and looked out the window at the city and thought about the wall with the painted faces, and what the people who built it had understood that no amount of galactic diplomatic protocol had ever needed to understand before. That some things were worth being difficult about. Vren's ultimatum passed the chamber by 6 votes, 30 days for Earth to accept a simplified version of the original terms. If they did not, the fleet would move to a closer position inside the solar system, not to attack. The language was careful about that, but to demonstrate that the Council's patience had limits. Orvith delivered the ultimatum to Dara in writing. He did not do it in person. He sent it through the formal diplomatic channel because he did not want to sit across from her and watch her read it. She sent back a reply within 2 hours. It was 3 sentences. Earth acknowledged receipt of the ultimatum. Earth's position had not changed. Earth wished the Council delegation safe travels. That was it. The 30 days passed. Earth did not accept the terms. Breck received the order to advance the fleet to a closer position inside the solar system. He acknowledged receipt of the order. He assembled his navigational team. He set the new coordinates. And then he did something he had never done in his career. He filed a formal tactical assessment before executing the movement order. It was within his rights as fleet commander. It was rarely done because it delayed action and commanders who delayed were not popular. He did not care. The assessment was 12 pages long. It detailed every piece of surveillance data collected over the months of the standoff. The volunteer civil units still active. The internal supply chain still running. The soft rationing that had become so normalized it was now simply how Earth managed its distribution systems. The complete absence of civil unrest directed at the standoff itself. The water policy protest that had continued for 3 weeks and had nothing to do with the fleet. He included a section on the single cargo hauler that had come out under the white flag. He included the exact words of the message it had transmitted. He included his own analysis. This species stated clearly what it would do and then did exactly that. They have not fired. They have not panicked. They have not negotiated under pressure. In my professional assessment, moving the fleet closer will produce the same result as leaving it where it is, which is that nothing will change except our position will be worse because we will have acted and got nothing from it. He submitted the assessment and waited. The Council debated it for 9 days. On the 10th day, quietly and with no announcement, the fleet was ordered back to its original position. Not withdrawn, just moved back. Vren's office released a brief statement saying the tactical posture was being adjusted for logistical reasons. Nobody believed the logistical reasons, but the statement gave everyone a way to move without admitting anything. Breck entered the return order and wrote 1 line in his log. He wrote, "I think we blinked." 2 weeks later, the fleet withdrew from Earth's solar system entirely. Again, no announcement. The Council's official position was that negotiations were ongoing and the fleet's presence was no longer operationally necessary. Dara read the news of the withdrawal on a morning when she had 3 other meetings scheduled. She noted it and continued with her day. The change came slowly after that, the way most real changes come. The WENEC representative who had taken Syl's data files went home and shared the absorption records with her government. The WENEC government published a formal inquiry, which was unprecedented. The Chilari followed with a cultural assessment request of their own. The aquatic counselor, whose name was Res, introduced a new motion 6 months later, not about Earth, but about a review process for newly contacted species, a longer evaluation period before standard absorption offers were extended. The motion passed by 4 votes. Syl was reassigned to a monitoring post in an outer sector. It was clearly a removal from the center of things. Syl went without complaint and continued writing, not reports, long, careful papers about species development patterns, about what growth looked like versus what stability looked like, about the difference between a species being safe and a species being alive. The papers circulated, slowly, then more. Orvith retired from active diplomatic work 2 years after the Earth standoff. He gave one speech at his retirement. He talked about the Irani singers for 8 minutes. He did not mention Earth by name. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew what he was talking about. On Earth, Dara cleaned out her office on a gray afternoon. She had been the human delegate for 4 years and she was done. Her successor had already been briefed. The world was not fixed. It never was. There were still arguments between governments, still infrastructure problems, still a long list of things that needed doing. But the Council fleet was gone, and no new one had appeared, and somewhere in the outer edges of the solar system, a small listening post had picked up 3 different signals from species that had never contacted Earth before, all of them cautious and curious, and apparently interested in what kind of people said no to the entire Galactic Council, and then just waited. Through her office window, Dara could see the exchange hub that had appeared at the edge of the city 6 months ago, not a council structure, just a converted warehouse where a few alien researchers and 1 human engineering team had been quietly working on something together for 3 weeks. She did not know exactly what they were building. She had heard it was something about long-range communication relay design. She had heard that the alien team had brought a method, and the human team had immediately started suggesting changes to it, and that, after 2 days of arguing, they had something that was better than either version. She finished packing her box. She picked it up and walked out of the office and did not look back. Outside, the city was loud and ordinary, and going about its business in all directions at once, which was exactly what it had always done and exactly what it would keep doing, with or without anyone's permission.